Hello and welcome to an NET News special, Nebraska's Death Penalty, What's Next? I'm Fred Knapp. For the next half hour, we'll talk about the death penalty, its repeal, and the attempt to overturn that repeal. To recap, in May, the legislature overrode Governor Pete Ricketts' veto and repealed Nebraska's death penalty. Within minutes, Senator Beau McCoy of Omaha started talking about overturning that decision. He now co-chairs a campaign to restore the death penalty by having Nebraskans vote on it next year. Senator McCoy is one of our guests today. Thanks for being here. What makes this issue so important to you?
Well, what makes this issue so important to me, and I believe to a great number of Nebraskans, is that we are in a unique time in America in which you see a lot of changes culturally and politically. But here in Nebraska, I think the people really believe, first and foremost, in public safety and public security. And many Nebraskans, I believe, an overwhelming majority, believe the death penalty is a part of that public safety focus, of which I firmly believe in.
Okay. One of the key groups that supported repealing the death penalty is ACLU Nebraska. Danielle Conrad supported repeal as a state senator, as executive director of ACLU Nebraska, and spokesperson for Nebraskans for Public Safety and Anti-Repeal Coalition. We appreciate your being here, an anti-restore coalition, excuse me. We appreciate your being here. Why is this issue important to you?
Sure. Well, number one, let me say thank you to you, Fred, for this generous opportunity to join you and to continue the important public dialogue about this important issue with Nebraska voters. Also appreciate the time from my former colleague, Senator McCoy, and looking forward to a really thoughtful discussion today. I can tell you that the death penalty is a very personal issue for me, like many Nebraskans. Coming from a strong social justice upbringing, I was always very concerned just generally in terms of disparate impacts on low-income people and communities of color. As a young lawyer and working my way through law school, I had an opportunity to take a few different classes about constitutional law and the Eighth Amendment in particular. And that expertise really informed my experience and decision and confirmed my belief that the death penalty is broken, and it's broken beyond repair for both legal, moral, and policy reasons.
Okay. Well, let's get an idea of what the effort to gather petition signatures is like. This was the scene recently outside the Lancaster County Motor Vehicle Office in Lincoln.
Are you a registered voter in the state of Nebraska, sir?
Yeah.
Are you interested in signing a petition to get the death penalty put on the ballot so that Nebraska has an opportunity to vote?
Yes.
Are you Lancaster County?
Yes.
Okay. If you can sign line 20 for me, it's 6/12/15. It's to restore the death penalty by repealing all of LB 268, enacted by the legislature of Nebraska, 104th Legislative First Session, which eliminates the death penalty and replaces it with a sentence of life in prison. We'll be around for about 90 days, so if you decide that you do want to vote.
I get to vote anyhow, right?
Well, if it gets put on the ballot. If not, if it doesn't get put on the ballot, there won't be a vote.
Okay, so why should it be on the ballot?
Why should it be on the ballot?
Yeah.
My opinion is just so that Nebraska can have an opportunity to say what they want.
Do they get to vote on everything though? Yes. I'm just curious about this. Why Nebraska should vote on the death penalty and they shouldn't vote on, say, like,
I can't answer
anything else?
So first to you, Senator McCoy. The legislature passed a lot of bills this year, some of which you vehemently opposed. What makes this issue so different that it should be decided by a popular vote?
Well, I think there are a number of issues that rise to the magnitude level that this one does, that the death penalty and what it means for justice in Nebraska and public safety in Nebraska, that it should be voted on by vote of the people. That's why on the second round of debate, I offered up an amendment to do just that, to make this a constitutional amendment, which a great number of senators supported, not enough to have it adopted. But I think the Nebraskans that I talk to want to have the opportunity. You know, our most sacred right, I believe, is to vote, is to take a side, a position on an issue. And we've done that many times in Nebraska. The people of Nebraska are the second house of our legislature with our unicameral system of governance. And I think that the right to vote, to take a position on an issue with as grave of import as the death penalty is one that a great number of Nebraskans want to take part in. even Nebraskans that support repealing the death penalty. I've talked to a number of them as well, who, even though they don't support the death penalty, believe that Nebraskans should be allowed and afforded the opportunity to vote on this issue in the general election in 2016.
Danielle Conrad, if people are as worked up about something as they supposedly are about what the legislature did, isn't that exactly the reason why there's a referendum process in the state constitution?
You know, you're absolutely right, Fred, and I'll echo a lot of what Senator McCoy said. Nebraska has such a proud and robust tradition of direct democracy. We're one of the few states that really does, and I think that Nebraskans use it appropriately. And so it's absolutely the right of every Nebraskan to take up that process, to circulate petitions, whether through initiative, referendum, or recall, when and if they see fit. It's absolutely the right of all citizens to sign those petitions if they would like to have an opportunity to vote on that. And it's absolutely the right of all citizens to decline to sign those petitions as well if they prefer to maintain the status quo. The status quo that we have today is the death penalty has been repealed and replaced with a smart alternative, and that's life in prison with no possibility of parole. That puts public safety first without sacrificing our moral or fiscal values. So that's the conversation we're educating Nebraska voters about right now this summer during the referendum drive.
Senator McCoy, what should the role of the legislature be in a representative democracy if not to make decisions on these kind of complicated issues?
Well, I think it is the prerogative of the legislature to take a position on issues of the day. That's our constitutional obligation. And it's an obligation that I take very seriously as a sitting office holder, and I know Ms. Conrad took very seriously in her 8 years as a state legislator as well. But we also have a constitutional process whereby the people of Nebraska are afforded the ability to get themselves involved more than just electing their own legislators to the legislature. And that's what we're seeing in this process. I think it's incredibly healthy for this type of a dialogue and a discussion to be taking place, not just the discussion that we're undertaking this afternoon, but the discussion that across the state that you hear. The challenge that I have with this issue is we need to be very careful that individuals and groups that can get involved on the national level who come into Nebraska, that they don't interfere with that sacred right of Nebraskans to make a decision of whether or not they sign this petition that would put this before a vote of the people. We need to make sure that Nebraskans are afforded that ability to make a decision on this issue without any encumbrance or discouragement from any group, nationally or otherwise.
Now, you've said that you will have people trying to persuade people not to sign. Does that amount to encumbrance in your view?
No, absolutely not. The appropriate response to political activity is political activity. The appropriate response to political speech and free speech is political speech and free speech. And that's exactly what our campaign is committed to. I think it's really interesting to also look back at the legislative record and look at what our second house, what our citizenry had to say during the course of this debate, which received far more hours in terms of time on the floor of the legislature and a lot of newspaper headlines getting people informed about what was happening down there. And you go back and you look at the committee record, all of those Nebraskans that came down to support the measure to replace the death penalty with the alternative of life in prison without parole, those were Nebraskans. And there was only one person who spoke in opposition to this measure.
Let me address that if I could, Fred. There may have only been one person that testified in opposition to this bill in the Judiciary Committee. But I might make mention that 38 times Senator Ernie Chambers has brought this legislation before the legislature. He sits on the Judiciary Committee. And as one who has gone before that committee many times with bills of my own, I will tell you it is extremely intense to be interrogated by Senator Chambers.
So you think people were deterred from showing up?
Without a question. That affected the numbers of those who testified in opposition to this bill, there's no doubt.
Point, do you think?
Well, I disagree with that assessment. I think the Nebraska legislature is one of the most open, transparent, and welcoming systems of government that we have available, and I think that position is really supported by the fact that whenever we have controversial issues before the legislature, we typically have an outpouring of public comment. Sometimes we even have to open up overflow rooms to accommodate all the citizens that come down. So I think that the facts speak for themselves, and that indeed Nebraskans weren't crying out in a different position at the point of the committee hearing and moving forward in many respects.
Okay, well, we need to move on. I just want to let people know what the signature requirements are. Death penalty supporters need to collect about 57,000 valid signatures on petitions by August 27th. If they get enough, Nebraskans will face the issue on next year's general election ballot. Beyond the issue of whether it should be on the ballot, obviously, is whether the question of whether the death penalty is right or wrong. Senator Chambers and Senator Jim Scheer discussed this when the legislature debated the veto override.
The world, by anybody's reckoning, is a place filled with darkness, contention, violence. We today can move to lift part of that cloud of darkness that has been hovering over this state for all these years.
There are times when someone will commit a crime in a heinous enough manner that that person only deserves the ultimate consequence to that action, which would be put to death.
Danielle Conrad, what about Senator Scheer's point, the last one? He's from Norfolk, where 5 innocent people were killed in a horrific bank robbery about a decade ago. Don't their killers deserve the death penalty?
Well, no one can question the emotional turmoil that that heinous activity brought upon that community and upon our state as a whole. But I think what's important is to look at the numbers, indeed. And when you look at the period of 1973 to 2007, 1973, when we reinstated the death penalty in Nebraska and nationwide, there's been about 1,450 murders in Nebraska. About 235 of those have been first-degree murders, the worst of the worst. 103 cases, the prosecution sought the death penalty. 31 death sentences were issued. 13 sentences were reduced by the courts, 10 are on appeal, 4 died in prison, 1 was freed. We have only 3 executions to show for this failed government program over the course of decades. And all of this burden lies on the Nebraska taxpayers. And this is a matter of conscience. This is a matter of moral, fiscal, and other very significant and serious beliefs that come into play with each Nebraska state senator's decision on this issue and each Nebraska's voters' decision on this issue. But when you have a system that is this arbitrary, it offers a false promise of justice to all Nebraskans, and particularly to victims' families who are helping to lead the way on the repeal effort this year and who are joining with our coalition to say, let's leave Nebraska's broken death penalty where it belongs, and that's in the past. When you pick and choose and you have these disparities, you create a very senseless hierarchy of victims, and that offers justice for no one.
Bo McCoy, what about Senator Chambers' point that the world's a pretty dark place and eliminating this state-sanctioned killing would lift a little of that darkness?
Oh, I disagree with that completely, but I want to first go back to address a couple of points that Ms. Conrad just made. First of all, there is no fiscal argument in the state of Nebraska on this issue. The facts bear that out. There would have been 3 fiscal notes, and Ms. Conrad knows as an 8-year member of our Appropriations Committee that we live and die by the Legislative Fiscal Office and the fiscal notes, and those showed that there were no cost savings whatsoever in our budget by eliminating the death penalty. So there is no fiscal argument in the state of Nebraska. There very well may be in other states that have a different appeals process and a different method of not only executing individuals but keeping them in prison. But the facts that matter are those here in Nebraska. There is no fiscal argument on this case. And I might also mention, when it comes to Senator Chambers, who, as I said, has brought this legislation 38 different times, you know, many times Senator Chambers has stood on the floor of the legislature and off the floor of the legislature to try to reduce criminal penalties, to cause Nebraska to go soft on crime. And I believe that's what we've done with eliminating the death penalty. The death penalty serves for prosecutors and for others as a tool to be utilized to keep Nebraskans safe. And there, in my opinion, are crimes, the most heinous crimes, that the ultimate punishment the punishment of losing one's life, should be reserved for those who have committed the worst of the worst crimes against their fellow Nebraskans. I'd also like to say that there are just as many victims' families who are for restoring the death penalty as there are against the death penalty. And we have a number of those families and family members involved in our efforts at Nebraskans for the death penalty.
Okay. If you're just joining us, this is an NET News special, Nebraska's Death Penalty, What's Next? This program is also available on our website, netnebraska.org/news. I'm Fred Knapp, and with me are Senator Bo McCoy, co-chair of Nebraskans for the Death Penalty, and former Senator Danielle Conrad, executive director of ACLU Nebraska. Sometimes discussions of the death penalty can get pretty abstract, but let's focus on whether it works. Senators Colby Koash and Bill Kintner debated that.
The taxpayers have not got their bang for their buck on this death penalty for almost 20 years. How many years, colleagues, will people stand up and say we need this? 20, 30, 40 years? If nobody's executed in 50 years, will people finally say, you know what, this is broken?
The governor announced that he has got one drug and ordered the other two drugs, and the ACLU is already challenging it. They don't even know what the drugs are, and they're already challenging it. That's the problem. And then they come back and they say it doesn't work.
How about that, Senator Conrad? Are the ACLU and other death penalty opponents guilty of hypocrisy for doing everything they can to challenge the death penalty and then turning around and criticizing it for being inefficient?
Absolutely not. The ACLU's position has been clear for many, many years, and that's that we oppose the death penalty. We oppose it in theory and we oppose it in practice, and that's why our organization has worked on the policy level and assisted with litigation in all respects where appropriate. It's absolutely news to me from Senator Kintner that we're challenging Nebraska's recent disturbing attempts to secure lethal injection drugs. We typically will weigh in potentially as an amicus or something of that effect, but we don't do direct representation for death row inmates, and there's a variety of talented attorneys in Nebraska who are very capable of doing that. If I could, I'd like to weigh in just momentarily on an issue that Senator McCoy noted. He says that we really need the death penalty as a tool for prosecutors. And I find that troubling from an ethical perspective. And we have very clear evidence right here in Nebraska about why that is a misuse of power. You can look no further than the Beatrice Six, folks that were threatened with the death penalty and whose clear innocence was compromised through years of imprisonment because of that very grave threat. We also saw that same issue presented in the horrific murders that happened in Murdoch. These were clearly debated in the course of the legislature, where we saw that Nebraskans who were indeed innocent of crimes they were accused of were threatened with this ultimate punishment, and it really made the system work in a very perverse manner. And so I think that most attorneys would agree that to use it as a tool, to use it as leverage, that's not appropriate, regardless of what your position might be on the death penalty.
Senator McCoy, I want to give you a chance to respond to that. But first, could you address Senator Koash's point? I mean, it certainly seems like Nebraska's system has not worked for a number of years, doesn't it?
Well, there's a variety of reasons for that. One being, I was elected to the legislature in 2008. Senator Conrad had been there a couple of years at that point. President Barack Obama had just been elected president. And the Department of Justice has gone through a very deliberate process over the period since 2009 of making it extremely difficult for pharmaceutical companies to provide the drugs necessary for carrying out lethal injections in the various states that use that as their means of execution, and that's virtually all of the 31 states still remaining that have the death penalty, and including the federal government and the military. They've made it extremely difficult for pharmaceutical companies to sell those drugs to individual states. That has been one of the big issues that we've faced here in Nebraska since we changed our method of execution from the electric chair to lethal injection in 2009, my first year in the legislature. The second point I'd like to make when it comes to this issue, and you just heard from Ms. Conrad, is, you know, we have this process where the legislature has weighed in on this issue a number of times. But what we have going on across the country, I think, is very unique. We have just this afternoon, literally within the last hour, a federal judge formally sentenced the Boston bomber, Tsarnaev, to death. Well, I would fully expect at some point the federal government is going to come up with a protocol, a method of lethal injection, of execution for this individual. So I have no doubt in my mind that here in the state of Nebraska, we will come to a resolution on this issue. We will be able to carry out the executions of the 10 individuals that still sit on death row, because I have every confidence the federal government's going to be able to do that. That is the reason that I believe we will and can still carry out executions in Nebraska.
Okay. Beyond these practical questions, arguments about the death penalty range from religious and spiritual to intensely personal. Here's what Senators Joni Craighead and Patty Pansing Brooks had to say.
What if someone that you love dearly was brutally murdered? If you can honestly say in that situation that sure, that murderer can live their life in prison, that you're okay with it, then you are truly a death penalty opponent. I respect that, but I don't agree with you.
There's no question that we need to punish for the heinous crimes and the terrible things that have been committed. But I tell you that my faith tells me not to play God. This is not a partisan vote. This is a vote of conscience, a vote of faith. Do you believe in the sanctity of a human soul or not?
Senator McCoy, what about Senator Pansing Brooks' point? Are we playing God by deciding to execute someone regardless of how awful a crime they may have committed?
Absolutely not. That's why I can be as staunchly pro-life of an individual and a person as I am. And I know Ms. Conrad and I have vehemently disagreed in the past on that very issue, because I believe that I can be staunchly pro-life, the protection of innocent life. Children, unborn children who have no other protectors than those of us who stand up for them, and at the same time staunchly for the death penalty, the carrying out of justice against those who are guilty and who have been convicted for the crimes that they've committed. I agree with what Senator Pansing Brooks said, that every life is sacred, and that's exactly right. And the protection of innocent life is very important, and that's why I'm as strongly pro-life as I am, and at the same time as for the death penalty as I am.
Senator Conrad, I suspect that you will take a different point of view, but before that, what about Senator Craighead's point? What if it were a member of your family who was murdered? Can you honestly say you wouldn't want to see the killer executed?
I could say that. I believe the death penalty is broken for moral, fiscal, and policy reasons, and have always been very clear in that position. That would not provide justice to me from my personal perspective. As I noted before, victims' families were really at the forefront of this effort in the legislature. And to be clear, they don't speak with one voice on this topic, but they were prominent voices in this debate. And when you see the conservative state senators that helped to lead this effort in the Nebraska legislature, they spoke very eloquently about their religious and their faith traditions, and they spoke very eloquently about their pro-life positions, where they took very seriously the charge to respect life from natural birth to natural death. And that's exactly what helped to inform their decision to lead the way to abolish the death penalty in Nebraska. So I agree, it is a deeply personal issue. I agree it cuts across faith and party in many interesting and different ways than we see with other issues. But there's also no question that many faith traditions have a very clear and strong opposition to the death penalty. And I think what we saw in Nebraska this year was that many of those faith leaders spoke out more loudly and more forcefully than they ever have before because of those sincerely held religious beliefs.
Senator McCoy, what would you say to a victim's family member who say they feel re-victimized every time there's another appeal and they'd rather let the murderers live in obscurity in prison?
Well, I would say to them what I have said to the ones that I've talked to, that my heart breaks for them. I can't imagine what it's like. No matter how you or any of us could try to imagine what it's like to put ourselves into those shoes, it's impossible unless you've been through that process. But as I said before, for every family member that I've talked to that has that position, you have another family member who says that, you know, I don't get the chance to celebrate birthdays and Christmases and 4th of Julys, graduations and weddings with my family member innocent family member whose life was snuffed out by a convicted killer who has been sentenced to death. And I want to see that justice carried out because I believe that it can serve as not only a deterrent for someone else who's in prison to think about not killing a fellow inmate, but another person who might think about committing the same crime against another Nebraskan. So for all of those Nebraskans, that's what I'm standing up for. That's what I stood up for on this issue and have ever since I joined the legislature. And my position has never changed on this issue, and it never will, because I believe that the death penalty has been a part of our federal government and our federal governmental process since the very beginning.
All right, we have just a little time left. I'd like to ask each of you for a final thought. What should Nebraskans be thinking about as they decide whether or not to sign a petition, and if enough people sign it, to put it on the ballot, whether or not to vote to restore the death penalties? Senator McCoy?
Well, I would encourage Nebraskans as you're moving about here and there about across the state this summer, whether it be the state fair, county fairs, parades, all the great activities that we enjoy in Nebraska when it's warm and nice outside. I'd encourage Nebraskans, regardless of whether you're for or against the death penalty, to put your name on the petition to allow the people of Nebraska to take action on this critically important issue for public safety in Nebraska. That's been our process. You, the people of Nebraska, are the second house.
Danielle Conrad, your final thoughts?
Well, again, thank you for the time here today and the important discussion that we've been able to have. My final thoughts are this. We would encourage Nebraskans to get educated about the issue before they sign any petitions. And we believe that once Nebraskans do educate themselves on the issues, they will decline to sign these petitions, because it's time that Nebraska moves forward. We have put in place an alternative that puts public safety first. That's life in prison with no possibility of parole. And it's time we move forward to focus on more positive priorities like improving our education system and providing meaningful tax relief. Those are issues that impact and benefit all Nebraskans, and that's exactly what we're talking about this summer.
All right, well, that's all the time we have. This has been an NET News special, Nebraska's death penalty, what's next? You can catch this program on the web at netnebraska.org/news. Thanks again to our guests, Senator Bo McCoy, co-chair of Nebraskans for the Death Penalty, and former Senator Danielle Conrad, Executive Director of ACLU Nebraska. I'm Fred Knapp of NET News. Thanks for joining us.